Games like Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time have all but disappeared from the mainstream AAA industry. The once thriving linear action-adventure puzzle platform genre has pretty much been replaced by the free-roam open-world action game, with RPG elements sprinkled on top. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with the latter format. I've certainly enjoyed my fair share of games structured that way. But this shift sort of represents the embracing of a design philosophy which amplifies an inherent obstacle in game development and plagues every project I've ever read about. Scope and ambition almost always outweigh what can be reasonably accomplished in a sensible time frame. This problem requires visionary direction and management, which recognizes the core principles driving the experience in order to make the right decisions on how to scale back and cut what isn't necessary. Yannis Mallah and Patrice Desailly, producer and creative director on The Sands of Time respectively, clearly understood how to do this without sacrificing the project's soul. When we talk about games, usually we spend a lot of time discussing either the artistic, thematic qualities or the nuts and bolts mechanics of gameplay and whether it all amounts to something fun to play. It makes sense because presentation and how we interact with games are what make them memorable and enduring for us. Rarely, however, do we discuss project management, unless it's in a negative light when we feel disappointed by something we've been looking forward to. For instance, if we take a game that's widely praised, we'll often hear about great art design, engaging combat, thoughtful writing, beautiful music, or stellar level design. All of this work is visible to us, so it's reasonable that those are the things that get us excited to analyze and discuss. The Sands of Time excels in all of these areas, but it's evident to me that it was the behind-the-scenes work, the management decisions and leadership that are invisible to us, that brought such great talent together and made something that feels truly inspired. Now, this isn't to say that the Sands of Time's development was without its problems, or that management didn't make a lot of mistakes along the way. To me, good management isn't about completely eliminating obstacles or having the perfect foresight to sidestep every potential blunder. Rather, it's about efficient problem solving and how the vision of the project can be best achieved even under less than ideal circumstances. After looking into the process for how this game was made, it seems unquestionable that the creative leadership had that kind of prowess. Prince of Persia, of course, didn't get its start within Ubisoft in the early 2000s, but stood long before that as a classic IP created in 1989 by Jordan Mechner and published by Broderbund. Though it got off to a slow start, it became well beloved for how it captured the spirit of classic adventure films, but most especially for its incredibly fluid animation quality, which Mechner achieved by rotoscoping the movements of his family and friends. After taking a break from game design to enroll in film school, he returned as a freelance creative advisor to help Broderbund produce a sequel, which was met with critical and commercial success. However, after Broderbund and its assets were sold in a disastrous set of acquisitions involving a number of companies, the 1999 follow-up, Prince of Persia 3D, struggled on both fronts, mostly because the developers weren't given time to apply the level of polish the series had become known for. Mechner, having suffered through 2 commercial disappointments during this time, was understandably ready to move on from the industry. Eventually, the Prince of Persia catalog was sold to Ubisoft, but the IP still belonged to Mechner, and because of this, producer Yannis Mallah knew he would have to present an excellent mock-up, something that would accurately demonstrate the vision of excellence he was striving for, if he was to convince Mechner to allow Ubisoft to move forward. Working closely with a core team of 7, they began laying down the foundation for what would become the Sands of Time, demonstrating most importantly a sharp change of direction from Prince of Persia 3D, while maintaining the spirit of the franchise, which had always been rooted in the tone of classic adventure stories with industry-leading, state-of-the-art animation. Their work spoke for itself, and Mechner was duly impressed. He not only gave Ubisoft license to proceed with the project, but eventually came on board himself to write the story and serve as a lead designer. Thus, the project got off on the right foot. It had a talented and passionate core team who were excited about doing something that hadn't been tried before, strong management with good heads on their shoulders, and both the blessing and cooperation of the original creator. Even so, as it is with all large-scale game development, there were a number of bumps in the road. Jordan Mechner describes some of the difficulties in crafting the story in an essay submitted to the Electronic Book Review. In it, he talks about the do's and don'ts of video game storytelling and admits that the first script they were devising didn't support the core gameplay concepts, relying too much on exposition-heavy cutscenes and telling a story that had little to do with what the player would spend his or her time doing while playing. In other words, he felt the story contained a lot of ludonarrative dissonance. Pop's core gameplay is very simple. There's only one playable character. The gameplay is a combination of acrobatic exploration, getting from point A to point B, and combat, killing everyone you meet. Plus, one cool original feature. You can turn back time to undo your mistakes. The challenge for the writer is to invent a story that will fit this gameplay, making the most of its strengths without highlighting its limitations. At first, the team started with a great title and core concept, The Sands of Time. Unfortunately, the first pass at that game script succumbed to many of the don'ts listed above. It had a proliferation of characters representing various political factions, a hero whose goal wasn't always clear, and long exposition-burdened dialogue scenes. Making the decision to scrap the existing storyline and start fresh from the Sands of Time concept gave the team the freedom to create a new story that would yield more bang for the buck. We took our new direction from the core features of the gameplay itself: unity of time and place, acrobatics, combat, and rewind. The rewind feature in particular is what makes the Sands of Time stand out from any of its contemporaries in the genre. The idea was devised by director Patrice Désilets, who, while working on one of Ubisoft's previous games, Donald Duck Going Quackers, would become fatigued each time he failed a platforming section and would have to start the level over. Instead, he thought it would be faster and more fun to allow the player to rewind the time and try the sequence again. This feature ended up becoming a staple of the game's identity, and served as the linchpin that tied the gameplay and the story together. In a post-mortem written by Millar in 2004, he detailed the most difficult struggles the team faced. The first was the late arrival of Raphael Lacoste, the game's art director, who didn't join the team until late April 2002, more than 10 months after pre-production had already begun. Before he was hired, several prototypes had been made showing off the main character's moveset, alongside a few level design ingredients, but there was no art whatsoever to tie it all together. At that point, all the potential the game offered was demonstrated with simple blocks and monochrome textures. Impressive maybe from a technical standpoint, but certainly not pretty to look at. Millar would go on to write, Raphael's first task was to define the artistic direction and style of the game and to develop all the necessary tools. Light maps were to be added to the engine at the 11th hour of pre-production, along with many other effects, volumetric fog, filter, glow, and so on. The most difficult challenge for the modelers was to keep a steady production pace for the maps while learning about upcoming and unfinished tools. As a matter of fact, the first final art wasn't available until the E3 2003 demo. Coming back from the show, the team saw the demo as the standard of quality that should be consistently present throughout the whole game. This seemed impossible considering just how much we still needed to produce. The demo was approximately 1/30th of the whole game, but the risk management output, including some scope reduction, and the tremendous efforts of our highly motivated team resulted in visual quality that surpassed that of the demo. Pre-production as a whole ended up taking a lot more time than the team had planned for. Their goal was to complete character behavior, macro designs, the storyline, and all tools before moving into level production, but with systems as complex as the ones they were devising, even minor tweaks to the prince's behaviors required major modifications. Millar went on to write, all of this was good for the game's overall quality, but we had already lost precious production time designing, implementing, and rejecting several complete fight systems. On top of this, the team simply didn't have enough time to refine the generic AI supporting scripted events, which meant they had to craft the cooperative sequences where the prince and Pharaoh worked together case by case. Also, since Lacoste had been added to the team at the last minute, final maps didn't arrive until late in development. This meant that many of the enemies' behaviors had to be coded on placeholder maps, which did not account for geometry. As you might expect, this led to a significant debugging process down the line, and many enemy types, such as sand tigers, had to be cut altogether. Beyond this, because every aspect of the prince's moveset matches with the game's geography, the level design was minutely context-sensitive, which meant that the team had to be sure their technical features behaved flawlessly. They also had to be sure that the rewind system was always functioning properly. Often, though, what they found was that enemies were forgetting their objectives, leading to broken gameplay where they no longer saw the player or attacked them, which meant the player could not progress past those sequences. So much could have been done in the earlier stages of development to prevent these problems. If only the maps and gameplay had been delivered in advance, a dedicated technical level designer could have foreseen all these issues and fixed them before alpha. Once again, we were not dealing with the problems in a strategic way. We were putting out fires as they occurred. Meanwhile, we were creating a mountain of bugs to deal with later. According to the postmortem, that last statement was no exaggeration. It states that more than 14,000 bugs were discovered and fixed before launch. To help make headway on that process, 14 PlayStation 2 development kits were provided to the team, 4 of which were solely dedicated to QA testers with the task of recreating very rare crash bugs. One day, we realized that one of our testers was great at finding A bugs, the rare, nasty ones. She was able to find bugs no one else could. Initially, each developer who was assigned to her bugs got frustrated due to the time commitment in fixing them. Then we asked her to join the team, equipped her with a development kit, and with her working on the game itself, we got our A-bugs curve back to normal. We replicated the model to up to 4 integrated testers within the team. This dramatically accelerated the pace of finding and fixing bugs, freeing some time for the developers to focus on the fixing side. Lastly, the way the engine was built also led to a number of setbacks and unnecessary frustration. Mala writes that game data was stored in one master file that contained everything for the developers to review: maps, models, AI, and the rest. Everything was centralized in this file except sound and videos. The situation didn't allow for multiple concurrent data access on the same file, at least without written permission. We soon realized our team had become too large to allow everyone access to the master files at the same time. We inherited a system that was designed with a small team in mind, but it didn't scale well to an army of 45 in crunch mode. Many problems occurred. Data was overwritten, the server crashed, files got corrupted. A lot of time was wasted because people had to wait for their turns to enter their changes on the network. Fortunately, a solution was found to this down the line, but a lot of time had been wasted because of it. By the time E3 2003 rolled around, completing the game at the standard of quality that had been set seemed impossible. Luckily, the team was such a tight-knit group with shared vision that morale stayed high even during a heavy crunch period. We were able to maintain the most effective form of communication: honesty. Speaking harshly about things that needed to be discussed wasn't a problem. We shared a common desire: the success of the project. No ego trip threatened the team's interest. Integration of newcomers could have disrupted this cohesion, but it didn't, because we didn't add large numbers to the team all at once. In addition, the game's scope was reduced at 2 key periods of development. The first came during Christmas of 2002, a time far enough away from release to delude the team a bit, who still believed they had plenty of time. However, ultimately the right decision was made, cutting an entire chapter taking place in a slave village. We accepted this decision because, in the end, everyone agreed it was the right move. If we had made this decision later, or worse, if we had refused to trim it, we would never have been able to finish the game on time. The second scope reduction came after E3 2003, where it became much more clear that they wouldn't have time to do everything they had planned. It meant that a lot of work they were proud of, that they had spent a lot of time on, would be lost. Ultimately, though, it was the price that had to be paid to deliver a satisfying experience in time for release. And to be honest, I think the game is better for it. Of course, I can't say that for sure. I don't know what was cut or how it would have flowed had they had time to include everything they had been planning. What I do know is this: Sands of Time is perfectly paced as it is. There's a flow to it that feels so fine-tuned and natural that I can't imagine adding to it would make the experience any better. For those who have watched my channel for a while, you'll know that I actually prefer shorter games. I'd rather play a 20-hour RPG like Chrono Trigger or Suikoden 1, games that are laser-focused and contain zero filler, than a 100-hour RPG full of extraneous busy work and padded side content. Sands of Time can be finished in less than 8 hours, but every area, every combat encounter, every puzzle, and every sequence of the story feels like it's paramount to the experience and never wears out its welcome. To me, fluidity, pace, and a high standard of execution in the presentation always trumps an excess of content. In other words, quality over quantity, and in Prince of Persia's case, the game contains only the highest quality content. As stated earlier, the gameplay of Sands of Time boils down to 3 core features: acrobatics, combat, and rewind. And perhaps the most lauded of these is the first, with its fluid movement worked so brilliantly into the well-designed platforming and exploration. It has a very ninja-like feel to it, incorporating wall running, climbing, and even gymnastics-like parkour. All of this is incredibly responsive, and one of my favorite things about playing the game as I was growing up was mastering the movement to the point where I could fly through these platforming sections at high speeds, which just feels so satisfying. Once the prince obtains the Dagger of Time in the story, you'll also be able to rewind time up to 10 seconds when you make a mistake, keeping the player's momentum, like the prince's, moving forward at all times. This power is limited by the number of sand tanks you currently have, and each time you use the rewind power, it depletes one of the tanks. Ultimately, you can unlock up to 10 tanks by exploring every nook and cranny to find all the upgrades, which will provide more opportunities to rewind and undo your missteps and miscalculations. The combat, while not as highly praised as the platforming, is still more than competent and ultimately a lot of fun. My favorite part about it is how every new combat scenario is set up to continually challenge the player, teaching them the skills they need in order to master the mechanics and avoid complacency, where they might adopt the habit of relying on the same tactics over and over again. For instance, some enemies will allow you to grapple and jump over them for an aerial slice, one of the safest and most effective moves in the game, but many others counter this move and will force the player into different tactics. The way the game mixes up enemy types to continually keep you on your feet and vary your attack patterns throughout each encounter creates a system for combat that, while simple, is consistently challenging even with a small number of enemy types and a limited moveset. Enemies can't be killed unless you finish them off with the Dagger of Time, which absorbs the sands of time that the monsters are made from and effectively kills them for good. It's not always easy to pull this off though, as enemy AI seems to always know exactly when you want to go in for a kill and will ambush and swipe at you just when you think it's safe to try and finish an enemy off. Learning when to defend yourself and when to move in for an attack is a skill you'll need to develop quickly, otherwise you're going to find yourself taking a pounding. Mallah put it this way: enemies represent particular level design ingredients. Being extremely dynamic, they need to complement the main character's combat skills. At the same time, they should also increasingly challenge the players and surprise them with unexpected behaviors in any given situation. We also used specific enemies as tools to teach the player how to fight better, an instrumental aid in the player's learning process. To this end, the developers did a fantastic job, and I can think of a number of fights off the top of my head that still challenge me to this day, even though I've beaten the game over a dozen times. It's true that the combat can feel a bit limited at times, and escorting Farah through some of these sequences can be frustrating for obvious reasons, problems which were addressed really well in the sequel, but overall the combat still feels really good. I love the way they incorporated the prince's acrobatics into the fights, allowing you to lunge off of walls, dodge roll, and flip through the air for stylish finishes. There are also certain time powers that can be put to use to give the player an advantage in tight spots. Freezing enemies when surrounded to allow you to focus on one at a time, or even freezing all of them, allowing the prince to zoom around and quickly kill them in a flurry. These powers are tied to power tanks on the left side of the user interface under the health bar and on the right side of the sand tanks, these white semicircles you see here. And each time you use one of your powers, it will deplete one of the power tanks. In order to use the power of haste, which allows you to freeze time and zoom around in a flurry, you must have all the power tanks filled, and the only way to replenish them is by taking out monsters with your dagger and retrieving sand. Ultimately, where I feel the game is most successful though, is in its planning and management. In most games I've played, at some point, the gameplay becomes monotonous because the developers don't do a good enough job mixing up its various features in a way that keeps the experience feeling fresh. Whether it's too much combat, too much dialogue, or too much time traveling without something interesting happening, Lots of games that have great ideas in place can still become boring to play if the devs don't have a good feel for pacing. Prince of Persia, perhaps of all the games I've ever played, is masterfully arranged and organized on that front. You never feel like you're doing one thing for too long. No sequence of the game feels like it overstays its welcome. In basically every case, just after completing a tough combat sequence, you'll have exactly the right amount of time dedicated to platforming and navigating through traps, then you'll have a great puzzle sequence that never feels too abstruse, then you'll have charming storytelling that gives you the motivation to continue moving forward without dominating the player's time with exposition-laden dialogue or cutscenes you end up wanting to skip. It's all so tight and well-balanced that the game never feels like it's dragging, and always presents you with a new challenge that makes the experience exciting from beginning to end. There's no fluff, no padding, and nothing that feels like it wasn't needed or doesn't belong. To me, this speaks to first-rate game direction and management, and not once in my many, many playthroughs of this game have I arrived at a section that I wished I could just skip past. All of it is engaging, all of it is satisfying, and all of it feels handcrafted and purposeful. It's masterful game design. The story, while short and simple, is also presented in such a charming way as to elevate it high above what the sum of its parts gives you on paper. The basic premise has the prince accompanying his father, King Shahraman, as they sack and loot the palace of a Maharaja in India while en route to meet the Sultan of Azad. Being enticed by the traitorous vizier of the Maharaja, the Persians can't resist the opportunity for honor and glory, and with the vizier's help, enter the palace and steal the hourglass which contains the fabled sands of time. The Maharaja's daughter, Farah, is taken prisoner amidst the chaos, and later, once the army arrives in Azad, the prince is tricked into unleashing the sands by the vizier, who seeks to use its power to obtain eternal life for himself. In doing so, all of the people in the castle are transformed into vicious sand creatures, all those except the prince, the vizier, and Farah, who are protected by special relics. Thus, the prince sets off with Farah's help to reach the top of the highest tower of the Palace of Azad, where the vizier is keeping the hourglass, to undo his terrible mistake. While the story might not sound like anything special when broken down like that, the decision to have the prince narrate the story as if he's retelling the events afterward is such a brilliant move, not only because it puts a seal on that classic adventure feel that is integral to the series' identity, but also gives room for some of the most charismatic, fourth-wall-breaking interactions I've ever seen in games. Anytime you save the game, the prince will ask you if you'd like him to start the story from that point next time you're interrupted.
Shall I continue my story from here the next time we're interrupted?
When you exit the game, he asks if you really want to stop him before he finishes telling the story.
Do you wish me to leave before finishing my story?
And when you die, he'll say things like this.
Wait, that's not right. I didn't fall. Let me start again.
All of this, in combination with tightly written scenes and amazing chemistry between the prince and Farah, leads to countless moments of wit and charm that really tie together all the gameplay concepts and deliver a story that is both unforgettable and every bit as timeless and exciting as the classics it was inspired by. I also think the prince goes through an excellent personal arc, where he starts the game off as an arrogant, chauvinistic, dismissive noble, but by the end is humbled by his many losses and learns to care for more than just his own glory. All in all, it's a fun story that is excellently told, and in many ways overachieves on its premise. The soundtrack is also solid, incorporating classical Middle Eastern influences with subtle and understated rock accompaniment. It was composed by Stuart Chatwood, best known for his work as the bassist and keyboard player of The Tea Party, a rock band based in Ontario, Canada. The Tea Party became renowned for the way they fused Western and Eastern musical styles, so Chatwood was a natural fit to do the same in creating the feel for the soundtrack of The Sands of Time. Despite his previous experience, Chatwood still took a great deal of time researching and expanding his world music library, and did as much listening to Radio Darvish as he could. Still, due to the lack of high-quality world music sample libraries, he had to augment what was available with his own recordings, and brought in vocalist Mariam Talar to cement that authentic Persian sound. Unlike its sequel, Warrior Within, which leaned far too heavily on the edgy, heavy metal side, something I might get into in a future video, Chatwood did an excellent job here of blending rock into the more ethnic sound that fits the tone of classic adventure so well, which brings with it the appropriate tension when necessary without betraying the series' tone. It's a very short track list with only 14 total tracks, most of which are higher intensity battle pieces, but it's also a fairly short game, and the sound is wonderful, being high energy and tense when it needs to be, but also knowing when to pull back. Prince of Persia has been one of my top 10 games since I first played it, and I can confidently say that it stands the test of time. It has revolutionary platforming and animation quality, great, if simple, combat mechanics, and a rewind feature that makes it stand out from any of its contemporaries. What really makes it special, though, is its strong direction, which balances every section of the game and creates a perfectly paced and engaging gameplay loop, something I find rare even in my favorite games. In my opinion, this was due to strong management decisions in tandem with the cooperation of the series' creator, who brought together an incredibly fluid and charming overall package. There's really not much more I can say about it than that. If you haven't played it, I strongly recommend picking it up. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you like this video, please subscribe. I have a Suikoden 2 video in the works right now, as well as many others aside from that. Also, if you appreciate the work that we're doing on the channel and you want to help support us, check out our Patreon link, which is in the description.